Get the feeling.
So no. Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
Care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS.
The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
Good evening. It's another Science and Politics show where we talk about what's going on in politics and what's going on in science, and also where they overlap and mash up and have a big fight, hence the name of this particular episode, which is all about vaccine war. Is it vaccine war, or is it a tacky, tabloid, jingoistic misrepresentation of a highly complex global supply issue? So that is item number one that we're going to be talking about. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on Astrazeneca and how they, with a perfectly good, safe vaccine, found themselves in a deep, deep political mess as of late, as of the last few months. And I'm going to be discussing that with Professor Martin McKee, who is an absolute expert in European health and European health policy. Then we're going to go on and we're going to talk about cancel culture. Who's being cancelled, in what cultures, what can we do about it, what is the productive way to go forward? And I will be talking with Vanity Von Glow about her experiences there and what we can do to sort of build a better environment where we all can express ourselves without fear of being cancelled for saying what we think or going and working in different environments. And then we're going to come on to some more science. We will talk about the recent budget cuts by this government pertaining to international aid, which is hitting science. So much as our government loves to say that they want us to become a science superpower, they've already done us quite a bit of damage through Brexit, and they are doing us further damage now through delays in funding Horizon 2020 and actually cutting over 100 million out of the budget streams that we used to have, causing a lot of alarm in the science community. And we will also talk about another fun animal, because I know you like those, and this week it's going to be the Mantis Shrimp. Neither a mantis nor a shrimp, but the Mantis Shrimp. And then we'll do our usual thing of taking a 15-minute break, in which we can all relax, grab a cup of tea, coffee, beer, liquor, anything that you like to get your hands on, and then we come back on to the Byline TV Patreon and we kick back and have some drinks, some questions and chat with our guest or guests. And so that's what we'll be doing again tonight. So make sure you stick around for that, our communal bonding experience. Right, so that's it. That's the program for tonight. First up, it's Astrazeneca. Now, this has been all over the tabloid headlines as of the last couple of months. The issues about AstraZeneca's safety, the issues about acceptance of this particular vaccine and other vaccines, but this one in particular, across Europe, across the world. Who's playing silly games about its supply? Who's playing silly games about its safety? Who should you trust? Is it the EU that's causing problems, or is it the member states, or what is going on here? And because it's been quite a complicated picture so far in the evolution of AstraZeneca coming on board, you'll see on the whiteboard behind me a little sort of timeline pathway that I drew up earlier on today, and we did a little video of me talking through that to get you up to speed. And as you're watching that, we'll be linking in Professor Martin McKee to talk to me via Zoom about what the hell is going on with AstraZeneca and the other vaccines and the vaccine nationalism. So, George, please run the clip. AstraZeneca, it's been on quite a controversial journey so far, unlike some of the other vaccines that are out there. So why is that? Why is a vaccine that is safe and cheap and that can be stored at fridge temperature how did it get embroiled in such a political circus? So let's have a look at the story here, because it starts as just being the Oxford vaccine. At the beginning of the pandemic, as it hits the UK in March 20, then Oxford, or the Jenner Institute in Oxford, is already working on developing a vaccine platform whereby you can use the genetic material of any kind of virus in order to rapidly develop a new vaccine. So Oxford is placed right at the front of the race just as it's starting, and that was led by Professor Sarah Gilbert. But as the government investment came in and investment from other people, the question becomes, who do you partner up with in order to actually roll it out, develop it, and get it manufactured around the world? Because the demand is huge. Just like with BioNTech, who developed the one that is now called the Pfizer vaccine, the UK vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, needed a partner. Now, initially, it was going to be Merck, the big American company, and there were wrangles over how much royalties there were going to be. Would they hand over their IP? And then it was insisted by the Oxford team that what they wanted to do is make sure that it was provided at cost, and also it was going to be provided to the world. That was their mission. Actually, Merck got scrapped at the last minute because all of their production is in the US, and they were fearful that Donald Trump was going to seize it all. So then they went with AstraZeneca, who promised to do it at cost. This was in the summer, early summer of 2020, and then that was the machine that gets rolling. And then when you get to late August, you've got the UK and the EU signing off agreements for supply. It's then going into trials, and AstraZeneca was paused briefly in the clinical trials because there was one death in the UK, but then they got over that. That was nothing to do with it. It was safe, and it was proven as being safe or accepted in the UK on the 30th of December. The MHRA gave its approval, European Medicines Agencies and others later, and then it was rolling out in the UK from January the 4th. All good so far. That's all fine so far. But unfortunately, when the approvals were coming through, there was an issue with the over 65s. In that, there just wasn't enough data in that category. Of hundreds of people who'd been involved in the clinical trials, only 2 had actually got it. So this was why it was noticed as an issue that we don't have the safety data for the over 55s and 65s. This got seized on by a German publication, Handelsblatt, that said that it was ineffective for the over 65s. And that all started to kick off right at the same time that the EU started having beef with AstraZeneca and saying, hey, where's our supply? You promised us 90 million you could provide, but you're only giving us 30. What's that about? That doesn't seem to be the case with the UK. And then they started opening up the contracts, because the contracts had been secret, and they realised that essentially the UK had got a more aggressive contract than had the EU. Now, the CEO of AstraZeneca was saying it's because the EU signed their contract far too late. The UK was in there first. That's how it goes. But actually, the EU contract was signed on 27th of August, and the UK contract was signed on the 28th of August, one day later. So then the head of AstraZeneca had to admit it was because the terms were different, and in the UK contract terms, it was supply us first before you supply anyone else. Well, anyway, this then really started kicking off big beef between the EU and AstraZeneca, and it started pulling in the UK government and the whole issue of Brexit when the EU started looking at mechanisms in order to control the output from those vaccines being manufactured in the EU, to make sure that they weren't shipping to the UK and getting nothing back from the UK. And that meant the inclusion of Article 16 clauses, which pertain to Northern Ireland. And that just blew up the whole Brexit issue then. The EU realised they'd made a mistake, they retracted within 5 hours, but that did major damage. That died down for just a little while before the issue of blood clots flared up again. And what happened there was some unusual blood clots seen, first in Austria and then in Norway. And so country after country decided to suspend the AstraZeneca vaccine for safety reasons, even though the data show that the frequencies of these blood clots are no different from what you see in a control population. And the WHO told these countries so, and the European Medicines Agency told these countries so, but in the UK it got framed as the EU was doing us down again, even though it was also countries outside the EU, like Taiwan, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Venezuela, or even the US, which still hasn't approved it to date. And so that then heated up the battle right at the same time that Ursula von der Leyen made another speech saying, this is getting unfair now. The UK hasn't exported anything in terms of vaccines, and neither has the US. We've been carrying the can with 41 million exports around the world, including to the UK, where they've had 10 million doses from us. This is unfair. And so her threatening that supply has meant the UK has accused her and the EU of vaccine nationalism, but they've been effectively accusing the UK and the US of the very same. And then more recently, there's been the issue of the Italian shipment where 29 million doses were caught and no one knew where they were going. And that is being resolved now. But this has all gotten very tense, and the trust in the Astrazeneca vaccine has absolutely plummeted on the continent because they saw it initially as unsafe. That was then reinforced with the blood clots issue. People would rather have the Pfizer because there are different options. There hasn't been anything associated with that. And so a perfectly safe vaccine at the end of the day, which has been proven so many times in the EU, the UK and the US, is suddenly in popular culture around Europe and the wider world being treated as less safe than other options, and it's got itself deep into a political mix. So we're going to talk about where do we go from here on that. Right, we were just commentating on how long that video was, and I had pages and pages that I was trying to condense down, but it really has been quite a complicated, convoluted and overlapping story, which has led to fury across the tabloid press about what the EU's doing or what Macron is doing or what the Germans are doing. And it has been feeding all of this horrendous sort of misunderstandings. And the question is, you know, have behaviours been reasonable, and can they be reasonable now? Can we get this all sorted out? And so I would like to talk this through with Professor Martin McKee, a good friend and highly esteemed Professor of Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also a member of Independent Sage. So, Martin, hi, what do you make of all of this?
Look, it's a very unfortunate situation, and we really should never have got ourselves into it. We need to step back and recognize that producing a vaccine at the best of times is a really complicated thing to do. And to have done what has been achieved to get a vaccine to market in such a short space of time, remembering that the virus was only sequenced just over a year ago, has been quite remarkable. But that said, we really should not be here. And we've got to remember that when the Oxford team developed the vaccine, they didn't originally go to AstraZeneca. They went to the US pharmaceutical company Merck, which had much more experience, in fact, had experience with producing vaccines, which AstraZeneca didn't have. However, when they then came back to the British government and said, we would like to sign this contract, there was a concern from the Secretary of State, from Matt Hancock, that if you do a deal with an American pharmaceutical company, it is entirely possible that that company could then be subject to an export ban from the US. And in fact, we know the US has not been exporting the vaccines that it's been making. So there was a push to say, well, you've got to find another partner. And if you partner with this Anglo-Swedish company, then at least they can provide some data, exclusive access to the vaccine. However, as I say, AstraZeneca does not have experience in producing vaccines, and we have had a whole series of problems going forward. At this point, I just want to say, I have absolutely no doubt that this is a safe and effective vaccine. That's not in question. But as they were going through the trials, there were problems with dosing. which were then presented as being something that was in some way virtuous, in that some patients were given, or some of the subjects in the trial were given a smaller dose, and then it was found out that they were getting a better response, but that was probably because the second dose was delayed, and there was a lot of confusion around that. And then you had the problem with the contracts, where the companies signed contracts with the UK and with the EU, promising to produce a lot of vaccine, and then was unable to do that. Now, that's fair enough. These are very difficult processes, and Pfizer-BioNTech has also had problems with production. But the difficulty was that AstraZeneca committed to providing the vaccine to the UK, and then committed to 120 million doses with the EU, and then has said it can only provide 30 million. And needless to say, the EU is not particularly happy with that.
Right, so you put a lot of this down to naivety, because that was my first question. It's like, why AstraZeneca? Why is it the unlucky one? When you haven't seen similar stories about Pfizer or Moderna or the Johnson & Johnson or even Sputnik, you haven't seen problems with all of those to the same level that you have with AstraZeneca. Yeah. And so you think that it's just lack of experience in this. I mean, they were picked because they could produce in the UK and they could produce elsewhere, and the idea was that they're willing to do it at cost and supply the world, and so all the good intentions were there, but because they didn't have experience of that really sort of big game in terms of rushing out the clinical trials and then also doing contracts with governments, you think that naivety is what has caught them short?
No, I think it is partly that we need to say that we don't know much about what's happened with Sputnik anyway. That's another issue.
Yeah, fair.
But I think with Pfizer and Moderna have had problems too. But I think the big difference is that when they've been talking about it, there has been a whole series of communication problems. So the initial presentation of the results was sort of as if the Oxford AstraZeneca trials had been intended to test these different dosing regimes. Whenever that was an accident, it wasn't intended, right, but it was portrayed in that way. And then we've had a situation only in the past few days when the Data Monitoring Committee for the American trials has had to step in and publicly say that actually we disagree with the press release that the company has put out. Now and then that of course was highlighted by the US National Institutes of Health. That is basically unprecedented. I'm not sure that that's ever happened before. And the difference was not a big one. I mean, it probably was not a statistically significant difference between what was in the data that were put out by the company and then what was the Data Monitoring Committee had and what was eventually put out in an amended press release. I mean, they were all around the same values, but the fact that they were different just really does not look good. Yeah. And then we've had this dispute about when contracts were signed, you know, a lack of transparency and just basically...
See, when the chief of AstraZeneca himself says it's because the UK got there first, and we fully see that actually the date for the EU contract was one day before the US one. They signed the EU one in good faith, and then the next day they signed one with the UK guaranteeing Britain first.
Well, that's exactly
it. And then denied it later. So then that starts eroding a lot of trust. And then also with amounts, because I can't remember who, but they said that AstraZeneca had effectively sold the same bicycle on eBay twice, or sold the same
I think that's basically it. Yeah, I mean, you cannot commit, when you know that you can only produce so much of a product, you cannot commit to sell it twice, and that's what they did do. So I think that's been really problematic. And I think a combination of all of these things have really eroded trust in the company. I stress in the company, the vaccine is safe and effective. We need to be clear about that. But the company is just not doing itself any good in having these unforced errors, as they've been described, in the dissemination of information. Now, of course, there are challenges involved. They have a responsibility to release data both to the scientific community through the press, through the medical journals, and also to the stock markets and press releases and so on. That is a challenge, but they really should be getting these things to be consistent, and they haven't been doing that.
So then about the health scares, I mean, first there was the one about the over 65s, where Handelsblatt decided to publish quite irresponsibly indicators that the effectiveness was about 6% or 8%, whereas actually the confidence intervals of those were between minus 1,400% and plus 98%. So the issue was that we just didn't know. And similarly with Macron saying that it was quasi ineffective, you couldn't make that judgment. I mean, was that excusable or inexcusable to provide data for the 65 plus category that was just incomplete, or was that justified for the sake of speed, or what's your read of it?
So the problem started off whenever the initial trials were done and older people were excluded because there were concerns about ethical approval. Now, there is a wider debate to be had about that in the same way that pregnant women are excluded.
So in these clinical trials, people aren't given coronavirus.
No, they're given. I mean, they're given this chimpanzee adenovirus, which has been modified, which is I mean, they'd already done the safety studies in the phase 1 and 2 parts of the trial, so that wasn't the issue. But I think there was this sort of, again, I think it gave the impression anyway of a lack of experience in evaluating the vaccines. Now, there was clearly an intention to include older people at a later stage, but it just did mean that you didn't have the results when you had it. However, leaving that aside, the reporting was quite irresponsible because, there's still some question as to where that 8% figure came from, but we think it probably was a figure that was misinterpreted as the proportion of older people who were in the trials or something like that. But people were correcting it on social media, were challenging it, and yet the journalist involved kept reiterating it. So that was quite problematic. Then Emmanuel Macron, well, I think it might have been helpful not to have said anything at that point because it really didn't advance the debate at all. But the difficulty
and it
that
undermined
we're seeing
the notion about vaccines overall, and France has got a very low confidence level now in vaccines.
Yeah. Well, vaccine confidence, and you're right. If we look across Europe, France is one of the countries with the lowest levels of vaccine confidence, although like everywhere, that has been going up. Right across Europe, we've seen an increase in confidence in the vaccine. But I think it all reflects the fact that there was this sort of loss of trust in the company, which was unfortunate because we do have a safe and effective vaccine.
So
but the message,
even though the European Medicines Agency was saying it's probably fine, it's just not as much data as we would like, a lot of the national regulators were saying that they weren't going to provide the Astrazeneca vaccine. They were instead going to go with Pfizer for the older age group. Was that a sensible decision given the data available?
So you've got to remember that you are talking about decisions by regulators. If you are a regulator in a country and for the last 2 decades, you've been constantly being attacked for being too close to the pharmaceutical industry or not doing your job or whatever. And there's any suspicion whatsoever, there is no benefit to you as a regulator for doing anything other than being ultra cautious. On the other hand, if you were wearing the hat of the public health professional in the country and you were saying, hold on, if we stop the vaccination and we delay the rollout, people are going to get COVID and some of them are going to die, then you might make a different decision. But you can see that it's in the self-interest of the regulator to be ultra cautious because they know that, if there's any suggestion at all and they get it wrong, they will be pilloried.
And so that's the same thing that factors into the blood clots, which I wanted to ask you about, because at the beginning of March, you saw it in Austria, you also saw it in Norway and Iceland and Denmark, I believe, and people were worried that maybe these were bad batches, or they were seeing these blood clots that looked irregular and not normal, and so paused it in order to check that out. But then people could see that, the rates of blood clots were nothing divergent from normal, certainly nothing like you get with the birth control pill. You have the WHO and the EMA saying that broad things considered, like the argument that you were making, from the public health interest, continue while you investigate this. So was there anything in that blood clot argument that there was risk there?
First of all, we've got to remember that the data were trickling in one case at a time. So it was, and the data were, it does remind us that there is a very good surveillance system to pick up any problems early as it was arising. But as you're getting cases mounting up, you're constantly testing to see if it's outside the bounds of statistical significance. It's a very, very difficult judgment call as to whether you think it is a real problem. However, even if it had been a real problem, what was abundantly clear was that the risk of blood clots was vastly greater among people who get COVID. It's a recognized complication of COVID. It's one of the reasons why people die. So therefore, the balance between any risk and benefit was clearly going to be in favor of continuing vaccination. But on the other hand, it was important to find out what was happening because you don't want to ignore early signs. I think I would have taken the view that I would have recommended continuing to vaccinate, but continue to investigate. But as I say, the regulators have got to look at the situation in terms of confidence in their own country and make a judgment call as to whether they feel in terms of maintaining the all-important confidence and trust, it's better to halt or to continue.
And I think guess the Hippocratic oath is first do no harm. So
first do no harm.
Yeah,
exactly.
So,
but also I think you've highlighted.
Go on.
Sorry. I was going to say one of the other problems that then got into this wider debate was, and we see this all the time. We saw it, in fact, on BBC last night, whenever a member of the European Parliament was asked a question about would she be voting today, and had to point out actually it was a vote in the Council, not the Parliament. So we get this confusion between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. But also, I think in the British media, a lot of confusion between the European Union institutions and the member states, because all throughout this, the European Medicines Agency, the EU organization, was saying that on balance they believed this was safe, but individual government, individual regulators in the member states were sometimes taking a different view.
Amazing, isn't it? Nearly 6 years of Brexit debate, and still some of our mainstream press can't pick out the difference. Right, so just two more quick questions for you, Martin.
Sure.
One is, all this kerfuffle that the EU has been making of we send them 10 million, they send, zero back. If the EU had been able to get supply from the UK, if they'd had those tens of millions more, would that have increased the speed of the rollout across Europe, or would we still really just be stuck in the same place because national rollouts are already choked?
I think you've got to look in individual member states. So the latest data that I've seen today definitely suggests that in France, at least, the rate limiting factor was the supply.
Right.
So they've been vaccinating, I think, 300,000. They're going up to 500,000 a day, and they're really ratcheting it up. Malta's done really well. Denmark's done really well. Germany's had a number of problems. So I think what we're seeing is that the member states control their own vaccination systems. And we knew from the very beginning, because we know what happens with childhood vaccinations, they work better in some countries than in others. I think it's unfortunate that all of them did not use the time to really plan, not least because we had published several reports and papers recently saying, before the pandemic, saying how you actually do this. So it wasn't, it was
our
clear
government,
what you
to
had
their
to do.
credit, put those supply chains in place. Yep.
Well, also remember that in the UK, as in a number of other countries, I mean, the UK is by no means unique. The Mediterranean countries, the Nordic countries, have got a very similar national health service. All of what we've seen is in this case with the British government, unlike what they did with testing and tracing, they handed it over to the NHS to do. And the well-integrated, coordinated NHS has delivered on it and delivered remarkably well. So I think that's a lesson for the UK. But we do have problems with fragmentation in some of the other countries, particularly where particularly where you've got more of a social insurance system with the fragmentation, and it is a bit more difficult. But it varies even within the countries that have social insurance.
Gotcha. So then the final question being, this beef between the EU and the UK over AstraZeneca and other vaccine supplies, are we going to be able to get it sorted out? Give us some hope, Martin.
Yeah, and I think we are. And I think what we have seen has been the Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, has been phoning around, talking to Emmanuel Macron, to Angela Merkel, and having discussions. I think the very encouraging sign is that the government in the UK has taken this out of the hands of Lord Frost and others who are continuing their rather confrontational approach, which has not been helping anybody. And I think doing it that way and really with a commitment to find a solution, because everybody recognizes that if there was a breakdown in supplies, if there was a breakdown in trade, it would be really problematic, not least because, of course, the lipid particles that are required for the RNA vaccines, like the Pfizer-BioNTech, are produced in the UK. So, you know, we have interdependent trade anyway. So I think because there is a real determination to make it work, then I think it will be good. But I think the British government is going to have to be quite careful in this, because of course it has created this climate of distrust where parts of the media here will attack anything. And we've seen that in the way that they're attacking regulators in member states as if they were part of the European Union. We've seen the confusion. So they're just going to have to be a bit careful, but it needs to be given.
They're going to have to stop feeding the monster, as it were, and actually start investing.
They might actually have to explain how the EU works, which would be a change.
Yeah, that's a little bit too hopeful and far-fetched. Martin, thanks ever so much for taking the time to come and explain that to us. Looking forward to catch up with you soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, cheers.
Good night.
Right, okay, let's move on from that, and now let's talk about cancel culture. Is cancel culture real? What does cancel culture look like? What are the cultures that are being cancelled, and by whom? We had recently, this government, in the middle of a pandemic, deciding to clamp down on the cancel culture and anti-free speech culture of British universities. You had a whole plan delivered by this government in very serious tones, talking about how we must preserve the bastions of free speech that are our universities, and it's unacceptable that people can be deplatformed and booted out all over the place. So even in the middle of a pandemic, they decided to appoint a free speech champion in government, and also put out a whole plan that essentially only allows you to get funding from the government if you're a higher education establishment, if you sign up to guarantees about free speech and so forth and so on. Now, that's all well and good in theory, as in, of course, you want to preserve and guard free speech. But the question becomes, what is the message being conveyed by this government? Why is it such an important thing to do? We are in the middle of a pandemic. The issues with universities are huge. We have just had them cut away from the rest of the continent in terms of free movement and the Erasmus program. We're in the middle of a pandemic, which means lots of students haven't been to do their lessons as normal, and also there are questions about their accommodation and their living arrangements. A lot of them are feeling ripped off. So if you're going to do anything in higher education that really suits the needs of higher education, then surely anything about free speech should just be, you know, a footnote in that, because there are no talks going on to cancel at the moment. And those that have looked at the data of this have said that, you know, out of tens of thousands of events at universities, there have only been a handful that have been controversial, that have been moved off campus or something like that. So it is a very small effect. And the fear is that actually the cancel culture is this government keen to cancel the culture in universities because it doesn't like the culture in universities being too lefty, being too anti-Brexit, being too critical of the government, with teachers and students alike getting involved. And in fact, some of the data they showed themselves in justifying this was the proportion of people educating in higher education that felt the need to restrict their own political views. Now, you could argue whether restricting your own political views or feeling as though you had to is actually a bad thing, because a lot of people may feel they have a responsibility to take their political views out of the conversation. So anyway, that is one debate about our universities, but there are some other examples of cancel culture, which is between the ardent left and the ardent right, out there protesting, getting on the streets. What happens if you intermix them? What happens to the people who dare to cross the lines between one camp and another camp just to have their voices heard and open up the conversations? I want to show you a little clip from summer 2018. George, could you play that clip first, please?
Now, last Sunday saw a protest in London by right-wing activists on a so-called Day of Freedom, but one person's presence gained more attention than any other, the drag queen Vanity Von Glow, who is here. Good morning. Nice to see you. Now, it has caused a lot of controversy, hasn't it? Because it was attended by some sort of very far right-wing people. Why did you attend, or why were you asked to attend?
I'm not certain why I was asked, but I felt like anyone from the centre or the left has as much entitlement to express themselves freely as the people on the right. And I think there's an argument that the right has managed to sort of co-opt freedom of speech a little bit lately. So what I wanted to do is go and express myself the way I always do, dressed like this, singing songs. And what I wasn't there to do was to espouse my own political views or in any way to endorse anybody else's.
I mean, the problem with this, I guess, is that it may have been sort of tagged freedom of speech, but it was, or is being seen as, in effect, a right-wing rally. Now, a right-wing, in some cases, who are perhaps racist, perhaps homophobic, not the sort of people you would normally be mixing with.
No, not the sort of people I'd normally be mixing with. You know, to be clear, I'm not a fan of hate speech. If that's people's concern about the language used on the right and on the far right, I've been on the receiving end of hate speech all week, so I can tell you it's not nice. But you know, I mean, for example, the former leader of the BNP has called me I've written it down because I keep forgetting it, I'm a sickening gender confusion. Right. I think the head of the alt-right in America has called me a degenerate. So, you know, needless to say, I don't endorse the far-right views being espoused.
No, well, look, I've got to say, I have some sympathies with you, because if you're getting that from the far right, and it's a dreadful language, but you're also getting a lot of stick now from the left, because you were there.
Oh my goodness! I mean, they're really, in some ways, they're just as bad. I mean, I would thank the left, because they do seem to have a slightly more expansive vocabulary than the far right. So they're not just calling me a degenerate; they're also calling me a fascist. For having associated with myself with this event. I mean, I feel a little bit like if you stand still for more than 5 minutes at the moment, the left go that far in that direction that we're all far right. The problem is that the far left don't just go for calling you names. Their sort of party trick at the moment is to try and go for your source of income. You know, at the moment, they've been making sure that, that my shows are cancelled. They want to see me unemployed. Possibly they want to see me homeless, and it's quite an aggressive tactic simply for disagreeing with my motives for attending an event.
Yeah. So what are you going to do now? How do you tackle this? I mean, do you try to keep your head down and let it drift apart, but you're not doing that?
Well, on the one hand, it's important, you know, it's important for me to continue to express myself in exactly the way I'm doing now. You know, this guilt by association thing is difficult for me to handle because I've worked very hard in my life to, you know, to promote fairness for everybody. What's especially difficult is that the venues that I'm associated with, some of which are independent venues, their social media has now become a proxy war between the far left and the far right, all fighting over this, which I don't think is fair. I don't want people to do that. I don't want these venues to be affected. While they're trying to take some breathing space. So I guess what I've got to do is listen to people's concerns, have conversations about this, and hopefully I'll be ready to get back on stage very soon.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I have with me here in the studio presenting to you Vanity Von Glow.
Yes.
Welcome, Vanity. But by her description on Twitter, internationally ignored superstar? Is
It's
that the
true.
one?
I am yet to receive the recognition globally I deserve, but I'm very happy to be here with
Well,
you.
yeah,
This is
Byline
lovely.
TV will be your launch
Yes,
pad
absolutely.
for sure. Sky, get out of here. It's Byline TV that's going to kick this off. So, that must have been a bizarre experience at the time. You were sort of thrown into the thick of it. I mean, you were just there for the sake of free speech. You get hauled up on stage, and you were there protesting against cancel culture, weren't you?
Yes, I mean, I would say that I threw myself into the thick of it. You know, remember how polarised, the sort of incremental increase of polarisation was happening around the time of 2018.
Yeah.
And I had just read John Ronson's book, So Now You've Been Publicly Shamed, which actually, I recommend everyone read it. It sort of breaks down so many of the instances of what we now have the language for calling cancel culture. It wasn't so much a term back then. And so when this free speech event was taking place, I wanted to make sure that, because I believe free speech is a universal value, it isn't owned by the left or the right. And obviously at this event, there were a lot of right-wing speakers. So I did what drag queens do best and showed up to express myself.
Yeah.
But just as things are, as we all know how...
So you weren't booked to go on the stage
I
initially
was.
then? Oh, you were?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was supposed to be at Hyde Park Corner initially, and then so many people
So
were
how
going
did
to be
that
there.
pairing initially happen? How did you get in touch and say, I want to get on that stage, or...?
So a friend of mine was familiar with the event and involved in it, and knew that I had, knew that I certainly like to think I have strong principles around free speech, so said, will you do this? And it was something that I weighed up, but I decided that, and like I said in my time on stage at the Day for Freedom, free speech is the principle by which minority groups are able to organise, such as my community, you know, the LGBT community.
So making very kind of like left-wing, traditionally left-wing, or I guess more modern left-wing arguments to a predominantly right-wing audience, how did that go down?
Well, I knew that there was a risk of being not well received by the audience, because there was like 4,000 people on
it was a huge
Whitehall.
crowd on a hot day, yeah.
And I did think, you know, they might not want to hear me sing Shania Twain's That Don't Impress Me Much. But I did nevertheless.
And the reason you sang that was because?
Well, because Shania Twain, people were trying to cancel her just that very week. I thought, well, this is timely. She had said that she may have, she understood why people voted for Trump, and that she might have done so had she lived in America herself. I think something that always frustrates me around the tone of, because to be clear, I don't think that cancel culture refers to censure or criticism. That's part of living in the world. Cancel culture is where people start petitioning venues to have, you know, Shania Twain's concert pulled, and where people try and kick up a stink. The ironic thing for me being that this is exactly what happened to me in the wake of the event. And by in the wake of the event, I mean within 24 hours, before anyone had even seen what I'd said on stage.
So you were telling me before, it was your birthday that day.
It was also my birthday.
You went along, it was your birthday, it was a new, big experience. You had some gigs in the evening as well.
I did, yeah.
And then you thought the day had gone fine?
Yeah.
Okay, and then, like, next day, it all started hitting the fan. And what happened?
Well, there were a lot of sort of, actually a lot of people from within the community of performers in London were, and I think I can understand why they were incensed and really confused, because all they knew was that Vanity Von Glow had been on stage
at this
at the same event as Tommy Robinson.
Yep.
You know, a person who, by all accounts, I have, you know, nothing to do with, and nor do I want to. And I think it was one of those things that the mob is a sort of blunt instrument, and it escalates very quickly. And by the end of the day, it was literally, you know, thousands and thousands of comments on Twitter and Facebook. And because of the heat and the intensity of all of this condemnation, people were actually calling up venues that I did shows in. People who didn't even come to those shows, I don't think.
So they were going out of their way to be vengeful and making sure that you couldn't perform there again, or what were their demands?
Well, I remember because I had a Eurovision party coming up, and so that was cancelled. I was taken off hosting that, so I lost a lot of work.
What reason did they give?
That I was in bad odor. That I, by being at this event, had brought into question my, goodness, or whether or not I should be welcome in those spaces. And that's the part of cancel culture I think is particularly difficult.
They didn't think you'd do any lesser of a performance, or...
Oh, no, not at all.
But it was a moral judgment that you didn't deserve to be around and you didn't deserve to be doing it?
It was very, if you know the movie Mean Girls, it was very, you can't sit with us. And I understand that people
And do you think that was from their own sense of principles, or do you think that was a sort of more of a market thing? Oh, if you come along, then we'll get complaints and we'll get people leaving early, and then it's going to hurt us in the pocket. I mean, which of those two arguments do they make?
I think that with a couple of venues in particular, they were literally being phoned. Staff in the one venue were crying because they were people phoning up the venue. I don't have a number online, so you can't phone me up to go and tell me that you think I'm a fascist. But they were, harassing, intimidating, I think bullying, morally condemning, and it was one of those situations that just got so intense that I understand why the venues made the decisions they did. I have since worked in almost all of those venues in the years after. So I always say I wasn't cancelled, I was merely postponed.
Right.
But I think the difficult...
But how did it feel for you at the time?
Well, I mean...
Did you feel as though you had an opportunity to explain to people why you'd been there? Or did you feel as though it was just such a wolf pack attack that they had to back off and you had to back off and you just had to...
Well, I think it stopped being about me in a way. I think it stopped being... I think that once the sort of hysteria of a pylon on social media has gotten to its peak, it's kind of just, it's snowballed, it's rolled away. It's not the same thing it was, when people were initially upset. I went on TV a few days later because Sky said, this is interesting, will you come and talk about it? And after that, I had this like huge sea change from so many people who were like, oh, so you weren't there to, wave the flag with Tommy Robinson. I was like, no. I was there because I'm entitled to free speech.
You weren't there to, attack minorities, specifically Muslims.
No, absolutely not. So I think it was a very challenging experience for me. But had I not read Jon Ronson's book, So Now You've Been Publicly Shamed, I don't think I would have felt the need to attend in the same way. But I also wouldn't have known what was happening to me when I was being cancelled.
Right.
And I think that it was a very difficult time.
But I mean, if you have all of your shows like cancelled just like that, and you're not expecting that, I mean, what does that do to kind of like your career, your finances, your relationships? I mean, surely there are big knock-on effects there.
Yes, I mean, I lost the better part of a summer's work. My shows used to sell out all the time. I used to do a show in Soho that would sell out every single Sunday. And so, it was sort of a fork in the road for me because I had to go around a long way to get back to where I already was.
Yeah.
I think because I turned out not to be a fascist and because, I'm a member of a community of performers. And I think that actually I kept showing up and I just kept entertaining, and I think that it's behind me now, but that took a long time. I feel like I could have done without it.
Yeah, well, I mean, is it something that you regret, or something that you're proud you've done, or just one of those things that you had to do and it was what it was?
I think.
What's your philosophical kind of like look back on that time?
I think if I were thinking, would I perform at that event again? Because I know that my intentions and my reasons for being there were sort of authentic, and they were because of an authentic belief in free speech. I think I'd like to think that I would still do it again, but I certainly would do it differently. I think if you're going into a very politically charged space, and I had no idea the extent to which, like, if you're within 100 meters of people like Tommy Robinson, they suck all the air because they're so objectionable. So it becomes that you're with them somehow.
Yeah.
And I think that to just sort of turn up out the blue, which is what it looked like. To some people, I think that if I were to do it again, I would have to be smarter, and communicate with my own community.
Yeah, because I mean, this is something that's important to us at Byline TV, because we find the crossover territory really interesting. You know, of course, like, there are dangers with it. I mean, if we, at an early stage, get on, you know, very far right people, you know, in here with kind of like no explanation, an audience, because like, well, what are we supporting here if you're giving them a platform or whatever? But also, like, for example, last week when we had Richard Tice on here, ex-chair of the Brexit Party, and we were talking about some of the political common ground, like with the policing bill, the audience is very, like, our audience here is very supportive of that, because they're starting to like, you know, the getting out of the left and right trench warfare and starting to put new jigsaw pieces together, because there's more intellectual satisfaction there. But we're doing it with trepidation, because you don't want to crudely just, you know, throw yourself into an environment where it just, you know, the wolves like come in and descend on you, and people question what you're about. So
yes, and I think that
it's a brave thing to do.
Even though obviously there was sort of significant negative fallout for me, I've always been of the view that cancelling people, so let's say somebody's tweets from 10 years ago emerge and they get cancelled, or they're asked to leave their job, and actually the cancelling isn't so much about the person being cancelled. The process serves to make examples of people.
Yeah.
And what frustrates me about
so
that...
So it's an asserting dominance thing, isn't it?
It is. It's to, you know, is J.K. Rowling cancelable? Possibly not. Is Jordan Peterson cancelable? Possibly not. You know, they've got such enormous fan bases. But attempts to sort of to take down people in the public eye and to cancel them, that sends a signal of not stepping out of line to the rest of us. And so, you know, I want an honest society. So everything you're saying about sitting down with people from the other side of the, you know, paddock, and and having conversations. When I went into the Day for Freedom, that was one of the most potentially hostile performance environments I could have ever gone into. But I'm not content, like I think many.
Because you had some people complaining that were in the audience about your presence there. They would storm off down to the pub and, you know, drink their pints and complain about their day have been ruined because you got up on stage, started singing.
And I'm one of the nice drag queens.
Yeah.
I don't, you know, I'm not getting my private bits out on stage. I'm very milquetoast. It shouldn't have been offensive, but it was for some people, because it's not, you know, it's not to some people's taste. But when you go into the lion's den and you're going to sort of, I'm happier, and I think you achieve more doing that than just preaching to the converted, which is what happens a lot with certainly siloed communities, you know, and so yeah, it was maybe a little bit stupid, but there it is.
So the question then is, and then we'll wrap it up for now after this question, and then I'll do a bit on science, and then you'll be back for the Q&A.
Science.
Yes. How do we sort of break this down so that we can have these more interesting conversations? Because your rationale for being there, when you explained it on Sky, like you said, people then got it. So do you blame the venues because the venues were uptight, or do you blame the venues for being weak because they were under so much pressure and they crumpled to it rather than standing up? Or if you don't blame them because you understand why they're doing it, then where do we apply pressure? Where do we apply work so that people's knee-jerk responses and that first wave of condemnation happen less, and that second wave of curiosity and support happens sooner and more productively? How do we get to that place?
Well, first, I don't resent the venues whose main job is to protect, that business. Kind of threw everyone in the deep end with this, which was a shock to everyone's system. So I understand the decisions that were made, and actually privately, some of the venue owners have been extremely supportive. Irrespective of having to make the decision to take my show off the schedule and stuff like that. I think that what we need is.
So you had to be understanding of them in order to preserve the relationship for later.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I think that that's what you do. In life, we want to. I'm a big fan of maintaining lines of communication. When I say I support free speech, it's not just because I think I have a lot to say. I don't have much to say about anything that isn't Celine Dion or Madonna. But for me, it's about what can you hear? It's that free speech is about communication.
Right.
And it does frustrate me the way that.
So it's two ways. It's not just about what you've got to say. It's also the
Absolutely
curiosity. You're just curious to.
I don't like
drink it
other
in.
people deciding what I can hear.
Yeah.
And yeah, it very much frustrates me.
And have you built relations from that day? Because after that happened and people saw that you were being cancelled, there was actually support that rallied around from you. I understand even from some people who were there on the day and thought what?
Yeah, well, the funny thing was that I was there with another friend who is a drag artist. We both had gigs immediately after, and we walked up Whitehall. And so many of the people that were in this audience who I had thought aren't going to get me or care came up and we were pleasantly surprised. And about 20 people on the walk up, and I thought, do you know what? I've come into this hostile environment and I've maybe reassured some people that.
And you've opened doors in lots of people's hearts there.
I hope so.
Did the reach out.
I mean, I'm an artist. That's literally what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. And you did it in a completely new environment. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. So I will do the science section now.
Yes.
And then for those of you that want to ask questions of Vanity, you've got to stick around, and you've also got to be one of our Patreons, because after this section, we'll then do our 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and have our drinks and chat, and you can throw questions her way and my way, whatever you like, okay? So now, last bit, science. There's one thing that, there are two things that I want to talk about. One thing is political, another thing is just a fun thing. But George is bemused by that. But with the political thing, let's talk about science funding in the UK, because this government promised, asserted that they were going to ensure that the UK was again a science superpower. They were doubling the budget. Dominic Cummings was wheeling in his big plan to set up a new US-style funding agency based on DARPA. It's going to be called ARIA. Throw big money at that. Blue Skies Research. He understands scientists. He understands what they need. But what we have at the moment, the current situation is, because of this government's budget cuts to our international development funds, then we have seen our international science funds through that programme cut from about 245 million to about 125 million. And that has not yet been replaced. It means that lots of science contracts have had to be axed all over the place. So from promising all this bounty, it's now being cut right down. At the same time, you've cut over 100 million and you're saying, oh, but we do have an extra 200 million per annum in order to support Dominic Cummings's fancy, which doesn't actually pertain to any science direction whatsoever, but essentially it is a slush fund for an independent body that's going to be free of bureaucracy, free of freedom of information requests, and it's just going to be a slush fund there, and it's going to be headed up by someone who's got good taste in funding for spotting quirky stuff. So this is what's happening. The real sort of budgets that are hardworking and proven are being cut at the same time that you've got a slush fund for whomever Dominic Cummings and his mates think they're going to have head up this new organisation. And then also at the same time beyond that, we've agreed to be part of Horizon Europe, the next EU funding programme, but where's the money for it? It hasn't been put in the budget yet. The new budgeting year is coming up on us quickly, and yet we don't know where this money is coming from, because if it's coming from the science budget, then that is another cut to the science budget, because this money before used to be in the EU channel, you know, our contribution to the EU, and it would come from that, and this is independent of the science budget. So if it hasn't been set up independently of the science budget, then basically it's another hunk out of our science budget, which just goes to show, and this is why Sir Paul Nurse, Jeremy Farrar and others are starting to make a lot of noises about this now, because we've heard all of the big promises, but yet again it seems to be over-promising and under-delivering, because this government, despite their professing their love for science, are actually quite busily cutting it down at the moment, and that's incredibly frustrating to our community and lots of people who thought that they had projects that they could continue on. Right, so that's that, and I should probably do that in more depth maybe next week. But now let's have a fun science bit, because a couple of weeks back, remember I threw in that little bit about tardigrades, the water bears, the moss piglets that are about a millimetre, well, half a millimetre to 1.2 millimetres long. They're like these little grubs with 8 legs, and the incredible thing about them is they are sturdy as anything, right? You can boil them in water and they are fine. You can freeze them down to just above absolute zero and they'll be fine. High pressure, low pressure, you can fire them off into outer space, they'll just crystallize up, and if they land in water again, they'll be fine and get moving. So a lot of you loved tardigrades because they're cute little critters too. And so I thought, right, let's do another fun animal that you should all know about. So I presume George is going to start playing you some pictures as I tell you about mantis shrimps. Because mantis shrimps, I see Vanity here, hasn't heard of mantis shrimps before, but these creatures, they're dramatic, aren't they? And so, right, mantis shrimps, they're not mantises, they're not shrimps, they're actually related to crabs and lobsters. They're crustaceans, right? And they've got various amazing properties, but the most amazing thing about them is their eyes, right? So these eyes, they're compound eyes, like a fly's eyes, so thousands of all those cones which are light detecting, but in the middle of their eyes, they've got this band. And in this band, they've got between 12 to 14 different photoreceptors. So we all have about 3, you know, red, green and blue. You know, that's what we detect in our eyes. They've got 12 to 16, depending on the species, right? As part of these kind of like swivelly eyes that they can move around independently. And those photoreceptors, it was thought, God, their vision must be like a thermonuclear explosion, all the things they can see that we can't. It went and got tested, and they couldn't differentiate that well between, you know, standard colours that we see around us. And people thought, what's going on? And then it was found that in some of them, within the UV light spectrum that we don't see, some of them have up to 6 different photoreceptors for the UV light range. And they can also detect polarized light. And that means whether your standard light wave is coming in like that or like that, you know, what's the angle that this wave of light is tilted at? They can detect that as well with their eyes, as can octopuses. So this little crustacean creature that, you know, varies quite a bit in size, has just got absolutely fascinating eyes. But wait, there's more, as they like to say in infomercials, because it's the way this creature also goes hunting which is fascinating. Their forearms, they've got these really well-developed forearms, that means that, well, they used to be called by ancient Assyrians sea locusts, and they've also been called prawn killers, but also they've been called, this is the most fun one, thumb splitters, because you don't want to pick them up. With that arm, they've got special trigger mechanisms whereby they can absolutely shatter stuff. So they will go up to snail shells and they will just bust it up. They'll just zoom on it, grab it, bust the thing wide open, then munch it down. If you try to keep them in a glass tank, you better be careful that they don't go and hit that tank. And there are others of them that have adapted it from like a punching hit to one that can actually fire shockwaves underwater, sort of making a little bullet bubble that absolutely knocks out prawns and other creatures like that. So these absolute glamorous crustaceans of the undersea I find to be absolutely fascinating creatures, and so do many of others. So that's what you should be looking up. That's your homework for this evening, to go and look up some more mantis shrimps, because they're just cool. And that is it for the main part of tonight's show. So if you are not one of our patrons and you're not one of our sponsors, then it's been very nice having you on here, but that is your lot. However, if you are a patron of ours, if you have signed up to us on Patreon, so that's patreon.com/Byline TV. If you're signed up there, or you'd like to be signed up there, then that means you get to be part of the after party. That means that you and I and Vanity here, we all knock back the drinks, we get comfortable in this room, we have some jokes. You send us your questions through Patreon, and then we kind of we chat and joke about those, ask us anything you like, and basically join the party. So whether you are or whether you aren't but you're interested, go and get yourself whatever drink you like, get comfortable, get settled in, and we'll see you on our Patreon channel in just 15 minutes from now. See you then.